episode, Sunday Code Meeting. It's Tuesday. Yes, I know. I just want to see another random faith happen around me. That's just... Oh. Hold on. That's fun. Hold on. So... Oh, sorry. I'm recommending the Dennis Cooper novel. Sorry. I'm just... Hold on. Hold your horses. I should have just turned it on later, but you know. Oh yeah. Come on. Oh, okay, so where are we? Begin to make a playground. This is a long beginning. Sunday go to meeting. And then we have a nice Mr. Limerick is with us. He's at a top clip. Oh shit. Oh yeah, that's fine.
Welcome to Sunday Go-To-Meeting, where we press this button which produces a random thief, active or extinct, always real or eternally fictional, grandiose or petty as fuck, and once the faith is randomly determined, we will listen to the homily of the week from the pastoral agent of that particular faith, and we will employ discernment on its message to extract what relevance and value it has for our lives. Now quick, we're a little late. It's almost 10 p.m. Who wants to be at church this late? Come on! Quick! Press the button! You press the button which flickers an F-whipples and gathunk. On the screen is the random faith of the week, Shintoism. And there in the pulpit before you stands none other than Sudiput Yumeruka, he whom some call the Anu Messiah, but most know simply as the Bear, your host today. Oh, look, they even got his hair just right. If you want me to say anything more about that, let me refer you back to my previous comment. Before I continue with the service, allow me first to thank all of you again for coming out tonight despite everything going on around us. Whether you've been watching the news over these last few days, or whether you were fortunate enough to have gone through your entire life without ever seeing an article containing the words Ebola outbreak, Zika virus, or any one of several thousand others like them. Or perhaps, if you're still lucky enough not to have seen those things at all, then congratulations are in order for having such good fortune. And keep up the good work, because God knows no one else will. But anyway, regardless of how much attention you paid to recent events, don't think you can slack off now, for there's a lot more trouble on its way, so stay alert and listen carefully to what I'm saying, okay? If it seems like nothing happened here today, well, that's because it did, because by this point, we already live in another world entirely, where every day is filled with crises far worse than what we experienced yesterday, each one barely covered by the news cycle before the next crisis comes along. It was different when we started this meeting 4 weeks ago, but once they closed the borders between us and Africa, raise your hand and ask if Ebola Zika hybrid is loose. Hand heavily. You must be exhausted from being asked to do this. I am sorry for asking you to come out tonight after hearing all that terrible news. I hope you weren't planning to go anywhere special afterwards. We're expecting me to try to get you anything, as I could very well run out and grab you some pizza or whatever. We all love you guys too much to risk getting you sick. No matter what happens, I'll always need you more than anyone else does. I'm going to give you something right now. Have some more water. Here's a couple more blankets. Let's pray together for our brothers and sisters overseas who are suffering through the spread of disease. Thank you for listening to my sermon. The benediction is over. Now return to your homes and spend the night safely, please, with your families. And remember, say you were going to bury your family tomorrow, but I guess talk's off the table now. Sell them cheaply on Craigslist, but only in countries with free shipping. Make sure everyone knows you're selling them by posting on social media and tagging their relatives. Found these at the bottom of the cereal box. Anyone interested? Cheap. Then sit down in front of the TV until your new neighbors move into your apartment building and take everything you have left. If they have children under 10, send them over here to live with me instead so we can protect them from whatever nasty diseases they might have been exposed to growing up on the streets. See, if they don't know how to use an iPad, teach them how. Then set them up as moderators for all the comment sections on the internet so no one will ever read what they say again, even if it is about important issues like medical treatments for Ebola. Or whether it is morally defensible to shoot a pregnant woman whose unborn child is infected with Zika because she just broke her neighbor's window while running away from home. Oh wait, did I mention that you won't be able to find any food you can eat anymore? Don't worry, there's still plenty of money, I promise. Just go out and buy yourself some drugs and alcohol instead. But yeah, anyway, you really should have seen this coming. Of course, people would start taking advantage of the situation once the borders closed. When they started sending refugees over here without screening for infectious diseases, anyone could tell that shit was going to get bad real fast. But we didn't know it'd be like this, though, right? How long has it been since we've had a major outbreak of disease in America? I mean, not since the last time I got strep throat 2 years ago, which is also why you probably shouldn't pay much attention to anything else I'm saying today except to keep alert for any symptoms you may have missed, like the feverish headache you're having now, which might be early onset meningitis. But who knows? Who knows? We don't have enough medicine stockpiled here yet, so try not to panic and remember, you can die from anything these days. If someone comes over with Ebola and says they don't want treatment, let them go home and hope they'll recover soon on their own before they infect their entire family. Just pray that none of us are infected too quickly so we don't lose our precious lives as well as everyone else's, okay? Now, come on. It's almost 10 p.m. already. Everyone's leaving the meeting house for the day. Go home safe. And I will see you tomorrow night for another service where I would give my sermon about how God hates all humanity equally for being so stupid and sinful. Only this time I will be wearing a gas mask because I know you will enjoy my sermon so much better when I sound like a robot trapped inside a metal tin can. Have a nice day. A Christmas Ebola to time 43. I do not know whether it was good or bad luck that placed me next to Marley, the dead man, in the same coach from London to Scrooge's estate in Essex. But once I heard him talking to himself in that way he always did, in those funny tones that were different than his normal voice, I couldn't help but ask myself if there wasn't some small part of Marley still alive beneath the unkempt beard of his and whatnot. For one thing, no corpse ever talks to itself. There's nothing more for you here,
That's not right.
said Marley, speaking just loud enough for me to hear over the din. Nothing left. Nothing for you now. Only misery. Then he laughed at something. At least I assumed it was laughter, but it didn't really sound like much of anything except maybe a wet cough, followed by several short chortles, and then an abrupt stop, as though he'd had enough and needed a breather before carrying on again. I sat across from Molly in our private carriage and tried not to stare at the bandage around his head or notice how poorly he smelled. He had been a close friend back at work before the outbreak happened, although not quite so close that we shared an office or spent most of every day together. I mostly knew him through his wife, Lillian, who worked alongside me in the lab division. I hadn't seen much of either of them since they took their own lives shortly after they got sick. The doctors told us they'd succumbed within 3 days of getting their diagnosis, but then again they might have died even sooner without any treatment at all because their symptoms came on rather quickly once they started showing signs. They went alone. Many people simply lost the will to live when they learned that there was no cure for Ebola. Tiny Tim. Wait, corpses talk to themselves all the time, they put thusly. Tiny Tim poots, and laughter was had. And there was no known way of treating it yet, even with modern medical technology. But my mind went off into another direction entirely while listening to Marley ramble on about his life insurance policies and various other things I could not understand. So it must have only taken a few minutes for him to get bored talking to me and start talking instead to himself in those strange tones he always used whenever he wanted to express something more personal than usual. This wasn't unusual behavior from him. Really, he tended toward being overly chatty regardless of the subject matter at hand. Still, there were some topics he just couldn't seem to keep his mouth shut about, especially when the mood struck him, which apparently it had done at least twice tonight already. "You should know," said Marley now, "that I did this for you." And then his head swiveled around to look directly at me, though I had no idea what that meant. Was it possible he was referring to giving up on life, to leaving behind all our loved ones? Because that certainly sounded like the kind of thing someone would say right before killing themselves. Of course, I knew that many people left notes for their families before doing so, but I'd never heard of anyone speaking words aloud in their final moments before ending their whole lives before now. Not unless they'd been afflicted by an infectious disease, in which case their condition made it difficult or impossible for them to remain silent as they wished, and they instead chose to do whatever they thought they could still accomplish despite how ill they felt or how much pain it caused them to move or speak or even breathe. But if I understood correctly, and why wouldn't I, given the circumstances, then Marley's remark was likely about something entirely different. He had killed himself because of the way things were going to be here on Earth once everyone was infected with Ebola, didn't he? Or maybe he had died because of his family, his friends, his job. No one ever really knows with these things. No one can understand how a person is feeling enough to tell whether they are depressed and want to end it or simply don't care anymore. So perhaps this was not a suicide attempt at all after all, but a more specific act of kindness intended specifically for me. But in any event, I decided I needed to talk to him about my current situation, for I truly did need help from him now. The train carriage we shared sat only 10 passengers across from each other, leaving us plenty of room for conversation, so I leaned over towards him, speaking low enough so only he could hear. "Marley," I said, "I think I've fallen ill." And then I told him everything that happened since our last meeting, which was back on November 9th. How their government quarantine order had prevented us from getting proper treatment when the first symptoms appeared in October. The hospital had no medicine available to treat Ebola. See, the feverish hallucinations I'd suffered as the disease progressed, the vomiting and diarrhea, the painful swellings in both legs and groin, and the terrible fatigue and loss of appetite during those final days. "Tiny Tim, we are still here. You are thinking out loud, I think?" Tiny Tim thinks so too, but I am still alive. I have not died yet, but I do not know how much longer I can hold on. And even now I could feel the tremors of weakness beginning to rack my body. But even though he hadn't spoken aloud before, Marley understood me well enough now and had no trouble responding to me directly. His eyes stared at mine for several seconds without blinking, and he nodded once, his lips moving along with his words so quickly that they almost sounded like another voice altogether. "The infection has taken a toll," he finally said. "Yes, it's true. I'm going to die, but I don't mind, because I will be free of this pain forever. I'll never have to suffer again if I just end myself right now." And I suddenly felt terribly afraid of him because there was something different about him than usual in that moment. Something dark and terrifying. And although he seemed aware of my fear, perhaps he sensed it through the heat radiating from my body, or maybe he could sense my thoughts somehow despite my efforts to remain silent and keep them from others' minds. He nevertheless remained completely calm throughout the entire conversation we shared. He didn't react until I asked for help from him, which made me think perhaps this was what he had been planning all along. Suicide by proxy so that he would take care of me while I wasted away inside this carriage. Perhaps I should have expected no less of him after everything else he had done in his life. "Tiny Tim, shouldn't we arrange for the CDC to remove his body? I don't think we are supposed to handle his body." Tiny Tim does not understand why someone would want to talk to their dead friend rather than let the government scientists deal with the corpse instead. But even then, even when I begged Marley, who could easily have escaped and left me behind as I slowly died, he simply stared back into my eyes and told me, You can rely on me. No, Marley, I said quickly before he could do anything rash and cause harm. I need your help getting off at the next station. Then you must find a way home, because this is where I will die alone. If I'm lucky enough to survive long enough to reach it. Because I knew now that Marley had only meant to kill himself along with everyone else here in England. Tiny Tim, aren't you a doctor? You know the risk. What's stopping you from escaping now? You aren't infected. Tiny Tim thinks I'm trying to save my own skin but cannot figure out how that makes any sense. And so I convinced him he needed to leave me here and tried to make his way back to his family or friends or something of the sort, though I still couldn't quite grasp what he hoped to accomplish by returning home, since he'd already contracted the virus by coming down from Scotland and was doomed anyway, even without traveling all this way. Tiny Tim, that doesn't sound right. He would have been fine by then. It takes several days for Ebola to take effect after infection. And there are many other people in the city besides you. Tiny Tim is not sure why Dr. Marley wants to go home when dying here. Sounds like a much better idea. Maybe they'll get together and do some dancing? And yet, I felt certain Marley had decided he wanted nothing more than to return to London with me rather than escape to avoid contracting the disease and instead continue onward toward his own death, just as he had planned. For whatever reason, he believed I might be able to help cure his illness, which meant we could both hope to survive once we got off the train. And so we would need to remain on board until we could reach Scrooge's estate near Harwich. But this wasn't my problem, so I tried convincing him again that leaving me behind would be in everyone else's best interest. Tiny Tim, what does your wife say about this? Marley, she's your mother. Why should I listen to her? Tiny Tim, so she agrees? Marley, of course. She wouldn't let me leave if she didn't want me to go. Tiny Tim, well, what if you were contagious? Wouldn't you worry about infecting them if you stayed here too long? You're already ill. So what if you infected them now and they got sick too? They probably don't want you to die alone. And neither do I. You can't die without someone to talk to. And I'm willing to stay with you. But it will mean we won't make it back home in time before the virus gets worse. Do you understand why that matters? The sooner you get home, the better. Marley, what's the use? Who cares if the rest of the world dies along with me? It doesn't matter anymore anyway, because no one would ever find the bodies anyway. Tiny Tim thinks maybe he means this whole conversation is pointless. We are going nowhere together. And he seems very tired all of a sudden. And at last he seemed to agree and stood up, signaling to me that he was ready to go. But just as I was starting to feel relieved and even grateful for all his help, Molly suddenly turned to face me once more, staring into my eyes once more for several seconds, as though reading my thoughts once more, or perhaps rereading the ones we'd already shared earlier tonight. Marley, you must try to live. Tiny Tim. And, see, thanks to everyone who attended this play of the Shinto Society. Now, can anyone tell me what Shintoism has to do with this story? The crowd applauded their approval, so I began to think it would be rude not to continue with this line in particular, since so many people had come to see the performance. Shinto, the Japanese name for the indigenous religion known as the Way in ancient Japan, a belief system that focused on harmony between humans and nature. I paused and looked over to the audience. realizing that only about half of them were actually members of the Shinto society, and most of the rest were there merely because they were curious about the unusual tale they were about to witness. And according to Dr. Marley's book, I continued, it is possible that the teachings from Shinto have much in common with Christianity's own faith. I could almost hear some murmurs throughout the theater as those present attempted to understand how two completely different religions might share similar beliefs, especially when each was based upon an entirely different set of principles. Perhaps it was the Christian God who taught these concepts first, someone asked, but I shook my head firmly before answering him. No, I said quickly. As far back as the 5th century BC, before Christ was even born, Chinese philosophers like Confucius and Lao Tzu wrote volumes discussing the importance of humanity and nature working together in order for both parties to flourish rather than allowing one to destroy the other. And around that same time, Pythagoras also suggested that mankind should take care of Earth itself by following certain rules designed to bring people closer to its natural state while also encouraging a sense of respect toward others. Both of these philosophies eventually became central tenets of Shintoism, which can be traced all the way back to early tribal worship rituals practiced in ancient Japan during what we call the Jomon period. The next question came from an elderly man standing near the rear of the crowd, his hands resting gently on his walking stick as he leaned forward with curiosity. But did not this religion develop out of animistic beliefs that originated long before Shinto ever existed? Well, that's a complicated question with more layers than you may realize, I answered with caution. Yes, many indigenous cultures believed in spirits and gods long before Shinto gained prominence among them. But it is important to note that although Shinto might have originally been influenced by these practices, it has evolved and adapted over time in such a manner that it is now considered an entirely new system of belief, entirely separate from the ones it borrowed so much from. I see. The old man nodded slowly. I paused again, giving him time to absorb the information. It took centuries of interaction between different tribes and their different forms of religious practice for some of these traditions to mix together into what we know today as Shinto. I continued. For example, native Japanese priests adopted some aspects of Taoist thought after the Tang dynasty sent missionaries to spread Christianity throughout China. Similarly, they also learned about Confucian philosophy through contact with Buddhist monks in Korea, both of whom had traveled there in order to escape persecution in mainland China and then brought back those teachings when they returned home later. And although Confucius himself never intended to teach a religion like Buddhism or Hinduism, his followers gradually turned his ideals into a faith known as the Way that served as a form of spiritual guidance and education. Is that what Shinto really means? Yes, exactly. I replied happily, realizing that my audience was finally beginning to understand what I meant by saying Shintoism shared common ground with Christianity. Shinto is simply the name given to all the various indigenous religions from across Asia that share similar values based around the concept of nature's balance. I pointed out at the darkened theater. It doesn't matter where in the world you find yourself right now. If you live in England, you will be able to read books written in Chinese and Korean and learn about how many ancient cultures used these ancient practices in their own unique ways. And even though we might be living thousands of miles apart, it should help us realize we aren't alone. And we shouldn't feel ashamed because we haven't seen a certain person on our television who believes in things differently than we do. I paused once again, looking over the crowd for a moment before turning back toward the stage. As for Marley, he was probably just trying to explain why humanity has so much trouble coexisting with the natural world or with each other, I said before taking another drink. The only way to avoid conflict with anyone else is to follow your heart and try to see the beauty inside every soul. Whether Not you can understand what makes them tick, because sometimes they may act in strange ways that seem wrong, but are actually quite logical. And yet, you must remember that no one truly knows what goes on in someone else's mind unless they've lived it themselves. It had been several months since the end of the world, and people had grown accustomed to life as it was now. A sort of post-apocalyptic paradise filled with both blessings and curses, with little food, less water, fewer medicines, and an increased number of deadly diseases. And while a great many were grateful for having survived, others simply felt hopelessness. There seemed very little left worth fighting for any more. Why bother? It didn't matter which side you chose anyway. No one could change their fate. And so some simply sat by the fire and drank their meager rations until they passed out in their sleep. Tiny Tim. Let's get through the survivor's guilt. Everyone! Drinking alone is not going to help. If anything, it will make it worse. The best thing we can do is try our damnedest to survive, regardless of our differences, even if it means doing something as insane as putting on a play for those who have nothing. We all need to come together if we want to find a cure for Ebola for the sake of the human race itself. Tiny Tim realized he needed to give the crowd a pep talk before they started to worry. That he would leave them forever after his final lines. He looked up at the bright lights and thought about the story they'd just witnessed, especially about how Marley's faith might be related to Christianity.
Hinduism.
Tiny Tim, you know what?
Fuck this.
This has got me thinking that maybe these two religions aren't so different after all. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I realize it is possible that Christianity borrowed its beliefs from Shintoism rather than vice versa. Because although both belief systems are rooted in the same core concepts, each has taken on a unique identity in response to the culture surrounding it over time. But while both practices are now distinct, perhaps one day someone will discover a common origin and combine both sets of ideas into a single unified system of faith. I stopped myself there, realizing my audience wasn't interested in any lengthy philosophical discussions regarding the origins of religious traditions. They wanted something simpler. They wanted me to tell them whether Tiny Tim's wife had changed her mind or not, since the doctor's speech was very clear about the dangers involved in remaining with him long term. And yet, despite this pressing concern, Tiny Tim was reluctant to provide an answer right away. Tiny Tim. No, she hasn't. She said we should continue our travels with you. So we'll see you again tomorrow night. Thank you so much for inviting us. Good night, everyone. The people cheered their appreciation as the curtain closed slowly behind me, signaling that their performance for tonight was finished. A few members of the crowd asked for more details on how it went, but I simply waved them off and began walking toward the exit. Tiny Tim, don't worry, you're all welcome back next week if you'd like to join us again. Thanks, everyone. The rest of the audience dispersed quickly after seeing me go, either because they were too exhausted to wait around after such a long show, or because they had a curfew to get home before midnight, and I could feel myself beginning to grow worried about the outcome when Marley finally found his way to meet me outside the theater. Where is she? He asked in an annoyed tone. She shouldn't have left without saying goodbye. It's okay, I replied with reassurance, although in truth I hadn't even thought of this possibility. She's probably just trying to avoid being seen out here. But then I looked over and noticed that none of the other patrons seemed particularly concerned by my absence, which only added to my anxiety. Had it really been that long since we performed? Why did nobody seem to care at all? How could they not notice me leaving?
Good night.